as I say, it's this opportunity of working through Zoom allows us to bring together a wonderful panel, two leading Africanists from North America, someone who knows the British National Archives inside out, and an early career scholar who's been working on the papers. And I think it's really interesting to see how the next generation of historians are making use of these materials. So in order of appearance, we're delighted to have my colleague at the Institute, Dr. Mandy Banton, who was formerly Principal Record Specialist in the Diplomatic and Colonial files in the UK National Archives, and is now a Senior Research Fellow with us. Dr. Jim Brennan from the Center for African Studies at the University of Illinois. And I should say, Jim has just published an article in, I think, the International History Review called The Secret Lives of Denis Fombia.
Oh, wow.
Which uses this material for a Tanganyikan who had very interesting relations with the intelligence services, it seems. That's just come out, and it's a fascinating read. Dr. Russell Moul, who's at the Center for the History of Medicine, Ethics and Medical Humanities at the University of Kent, and has done some really interesting research on medical professionals in the detention camps. And finally, Professor Caroline Elkins, Professor of History and African American Studies at Harvard University, who was part of the Hanslope Park story. It was her campaign that helped to bring justice for former Myanmar detainees, and in the process of trying to get them justice, forced the British government to reveal the existence of the so-called Migrated archives in 2011. Thousands of files that have been spirited out of former British colonies on independence. So it's wonderful to be able to bring these four scholars together, and thank you so much for doing this. It is not the first time we've looked at this subject. Going back to February 2015, when the files were really genuinely newly released, we held a workshop on them, again with some distinguished scholars, Dan Branch, Emma Hunter, John Lonsdale, David French. Mandy took part in that as well, and so it's great to have her with us to catch up. And on the chat, I've just posted the link to a little blog piece that we published on that 2015 workshop. And it was clear already at that point that one of the interesting things that the papers did hold was material on local intelligence operations. The files of local special branches often destroyed or disappeared, but there's some really interesting material there. That was clear in 2015, and it's been increasingly clear in the work that other scholars have done since then. At the same time, I think there was a kind of there was an alert, if you like, about how we view this sort of material. That obviously there's a huge amount of journalistic interest in it. George Monbiot wrote a piece in The Guardian a couple of days ago about the files. Ian Cobain, of course, wrote History Thieves about this very subject, about the suppression of historical documents. And it is a scandal, and as historians, we have a duty to campaign hard to get these materials and to find out if they were destroyed, what happened to them, and why. But Carl Hack, interestingly enough, a historian of the emergency in Malaya, gave a note of warning. He said, look, there is a danger that we're almost moving backwards. We've got to a stage when we're starting to use other sorts of evidence rather than, National Archives files of various sorts, official files. And, our panelists here today are very familiar with this. In fact, Caroline Elkins has done really pioneering oral history work on Mau Mau and Kenya in the 50s. So our panelists don't need reminding of that. But it's an interesting broader point that we might want to touch on in the course of our discussions. So please do tweet about the event as it's happening. Maybe hashtag Hanslope Park. I'll kick off and do that and just generate a bit of publicity about this. So that's the order in which we're going to take speakers. So Mandy, Jim, Russell, Caroline, and they're each going to speak for about 15 minutes. In the meantime, if you have a question, please use the chat function, which is, if you haven't used it, there's a little dialog box towards the bottom of your screen, and you can just type in a message, a question, and then when our four speakers are finished, I'll round up the questions and put them to the panelists. Or indeed, if there are people who have particular interest in this topic and would like to come in, say something more extensive, then please just indicate that. And finally, we have a wonderful panel, but we can't do justice in one single seminar to this extraordinary topic. So if you've worked yourself on this subject, on these files, you feel you have interesting things to say about them, this won't be the last seminar we organize. It would be nice to have a follow-up, maybe looking at files from other areas. So please let me know either during the session or by email afterwards. But without further ado, let me introduce Mandy. Thank you. Mandy, over to you. You just unmute. Yeah, that's it.
Okay. Thank you, Philip. This is a new experience for me. I've listened to other people speaking on Zoom, but the idea of me speaking to numerous persons from my own house is a bit daunting. Hopefully you'll be able to hear me, and Philip will jump in if there are any problems, I'm sure. I'm going to read my paper rather than speaking more informally, so I hope that works. My interest in the migrated archives has been less in their content and more in two other aspects. First, developing Colonial Office policy on the disposal of colonial government records, the custody of those records removed to the UK, and the sporadic and often contradictory discussions about their legal status. And second, the ongoing international debate about displaced archives more generally, and the attempts to arrive at solutions to questions of ownership, repatriation, and sharing. In the years since 2015, and particularly since 2017, I have concentrated primarily on the second of these, although I have also given some more attention to the question of legal status. In 2011, the FCO obtained a legal opinion that the migrated archives are UK public records. This contradicted a previous opinion that they are not. The earlier 1976 opinion came from the Lord Chancellor, then the responsible authority. His judicial role in such matters was abolished by the Constitutional Reform Act of 2005. My Freedom of Information request for release of the 2011 opinion was declined on grounds that it was exempt information under the Legal Professional Privilege section of the FOI Act. I do not believe for one moment that the migrated archives are UK public records, so it would be interesting, maybe helpful, to see the opinion and perhaps learn how it was reached. Last year, I searched records relating to the drafting of the 1958 Public Records Act for some reference to the records of colonial governments. I used primarily, though not exclusively, files of the lead department, the Lord Chancellor's Office, which are voluminous and sometimes poorly organised. There was nothing. The only Colonial Office correspondence on these LCO files relates to two subjects: the status of the records of the Crown agents and the drafting of a section of the Act concerning countries to which UK public records might, in certain circumstances, be presented. There is no surviving Colonial Office file. LCO papers do discuss the records of those outposts of UK government departments to be covered by the Act, citing embassy and consular records and those of naval stations and military establishments. Surely colonial governments would have been included had there been any suggestion that their records belonged to the UK. I suspect that there was a more clandestine debate. There is a clue in correspondence between the LCO and the Cabinet Office at the very end of 1958. This focused on the extreme sensitivity of some government records. The responsible LCO official believed that certain information should be excluded from general circulars about the Public Records Act sent to UK government departments. The risks of it getting into the newspapers, he wrote, should not be ignored. He continued, what is said about India Office records and records on Commonwealth matters might be embarrassing. It was, of course, exactly at this time that the Colonial Office was most concerned with the disposal of colonial government records. On the other hand, I still like to think that the absence of any recorded discussion of the status of colonial government records in the context of the drafting of public records legislation confirms that it was so obvious to all concerned that they were not UK public records, that there was no reason to mention them. Colonial governments were certainly not outposts of the UK government, but separate entities. A new interpretation of legal status was given to the Kenyans in 2017, when a lawyer pointed out that during the Moul litigation, the High Court ruled that rights, liabilities, and obligations of the Kenya colony transferred to the independent state. The implication, as a matter of public international law, is that the ownership of archival material in the possession of the Kenya colony also transferred to the independent Kenyan government. The records were owned by Kenya and remain the property of Kenya. Their physical location does not change that. A wider question which might be examined is, of course, whether constitutional legislation enacted for other British colonies at independence can be interpreted in the same way. I had hoped, and am still hoping, that the Kenyan government will pursue this. I and some colleagues put together a briefing for the director of the Kenya National Archives and have discussed the matter with him on several occasions. In Kenya in 2018, I had the opportunity to brief the Attorney General and the President himself. They, of course, have other priorities. Rather than continuing my research on these topics, I have more recently been working with many others to draw attention to the migrated archives and other displaced collections, and to seek possible solutions to some intractable problems. In 2017, I contributed to James Lowery's edited book, Displaced Archives, and drafted a position paper adopted by the Association of Commonwealth Archivists and Records Managers, which is known as ACARM. ACARM's position is that the migrated archives are the property of the countries from which they were removed. It believes that repatriation of the records is the legally and ethically correct course. If repatriation continues to be unacceptable to the British government, ACARM encourages it to demonstrate transparency by making public the 2011 legal opinion that is the basis of its determination to retain the records. ACARM also encourages the government to demonstrate goodwill to the governments and peoples with which its history is intertwined by providing free digital copies to the countries concerned. It is, of course, one thing to draw up such a paper, but quite another to bring it to the attention of the appropriate authority, let alone to influence that authority. I asked my Member of Parliament for assistance. She passed the paper and my explanatory notes to the then Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson. Specific points raised by ACARM were ignored. The reply merely parroted the standard FCO position that the Migrated Archives are UK public records and that anyone can visit TNA or order copies. Neither option is possible for most citizens of the countries concerned. The British government really does stand out in its continuing refusal to contemplate any sharing of the Migrated Archives or even enter into meaningful discussions. I worked again with James Lowry last year to explore with the all-party parliamentary group on archives and history the possibility of holding an event on the Migrated Archives at Westminster. Unfortunately, the group decided to first concentrate on another topic. Their administrator, with whom we had done a considerable amount of preparatory work, left at short notice, and the impetus was lost. We need to reopen that discussion. In the meantime, the International Council on Archives, the ICA, renewed its interest in migrated or displaced archives. In 2017, it established an expert group on what it has called shared archival heritage. I was appointed a member, and my first task was to organise a panel for the 2018 annual ICA conference in Cameroon, the first in the ICA's 70-year history held in Africa. My contributors came from Iceland, the Netherlands, Suriname, Mozambique, Namibia, Botswana, and the UK. We were lucky enough to have the only room with simultaneous translation, and the panel was very well attended and very well received. My report has just this month been published in the ICA Journal. Our programme was planned to outline the circumstances in which archives have been removed or displaced, focusing on the colonial and post-colonial periods, and with particular emphasis on the Anglophone and Lusophone African experiences, the attempts by individual states to identify and retrieve archival materials or the free provision of copies, and the uneven responses of former metropolitan powers. There are, in fact, many examples of the return of documentation. The Netherlands has returned papers to Indonesia and Suriname and facilitated copying. Germany has returned papers to Namibia, as has South Africa. Rather different examples include Russia's return to the Netherlands of documentation seized from the Nazis at the end of the Second World War. An unusual initiative concerns records relating to the operation of Japanese companies in Australia, which have been sent to Japan. These are genuinely Australian documents, but were only ever of interest to researchers from Japan. The Australian State Archivist, who is the current president of the ICA, believes that archives should be where they are of most use. Regional branches of the ICA, especially the Eastern and Southern Africa branch, have been much concerned with these issues for decades. And the Caribbean branch has recently sought to align the matter with the work of the Reparations Commission set up by CARICOM. Another comparatively recent development is that Indigenous inhabitants, First Peoples, are increasingly demanding relevant documentation from their national governments. This was mentioned particularly in the context of Canada and Trinidad. During the course of the Cameroon conference, we learned that a report commissioned by President Macron had just been published. The previous year, in a speech in Burkina Faso, Macron had expressed his regret that so much of the cultural history of Africa remains in French museums, and announced his intention to return artifacts. It was unclear initially if he was including archives. which UNESCO defined as cultural property many years ago, but the report does cover them to some extent. The authors explain that according to their remit, they had considered only archives in public museums and affiliated institutions, but they believe that the wider question of administrative, diplomatic, military, etc. archives is also of the utmost urgency and should be the object of another specific mission. I have long been concerned that although the possible return of museum holdings excites much media and public debate, there is little interest in archives. In 2018, I wrote a short opinion piece for the Round Table, which I called Precious Artifacts versus Dusty Files. Late last year, the lawyer Geoffrey Robertson published his book, Who Owns History? Elkins Loot and the Case for Returning Plundered Treasure. He does not directly discuss the parallel situation of archives, but his suggested draft for a new international convention does include them. Robertson spoke at an event hosted by the Museum of Colonialism earlier this year, and I would like to pay tribute to the organisers of that UK-Kenya collective, who have done much to publicise the Migrated archives, particularly through their documentary film, Operation Legacy. Another speaker at that event was from the Pat Finucane Centre. He described their project called The Poisonous Legacy of Colonialism, which derived much of its content directly or indirectly from the Migrated archives. An introduction to the project asked, why would a Northern Irish-based human rights NGO produce an exhibition on the legacy of colonialism? The answer lies in its examination of military and policing techniques developed at the end of empire in Cyprus, Kenya, Malaya, Palestine, and other corners of the British Empire, and applied in Ireland during the Troubles. Although I'm delighted to see the growing international interest in these matters, I would be even more delighted to see more practical progress. In 1976, a UNESCO report stated, and I quote, archives are an essential part of the heritage of any national community. They not only document the historical, cultural, and economic development of a country and provide a basis for a national identity, they are also a basic source of evidence needed to assert the rights of individual citizens. Changes in territorial boundaries and sovereignty have deprived many countries of at least part of their rightful archival heritage. It is important to all nations and to mankind generally that the problem of providing access to archives and their restitution in cases where such action is required should be dealt with urgently. If it was urgent 44 years ago, what is it now? I will leave you with that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Mandy. It's a fascinating overview and wonderful to have that big picture and the comparative picture as well, which I suppose British historians often lack. This is part of a wider movement. Thank you so much. I'll move on to Jim Brennan next. Jim, please.
Thank you. I will be pretty short with my talk, and I just want to give you a sense of how I've approached the Migrated Archives and how I've used it for a couple of projects, but in particular an article that I just published this week, actually, that Philip referred to at the beginning of this talk, which is entitled The Secret Lives of Dennis Pombea. Dennis Pombea was a man from Nyasaland, modern-day Malawi, who led a very itinerant life, appears to have spent time in South Africa, entered the King's African Rifles, worked in Kenya, and then ultimately came to Tanganyika in the early 1950s. So I just wanted to set up his life, because the article is essentially a biography of a person who was an informant for a variety of intelligence agencies. And my initial interest in the Migrated Archives actually wasn't so much about the workings of the special branch. It was just sort of more rich political information. I will freely admit I spent a lot of time working at Kew since the 1990s, primarily to extract information relating to colonial Tanganyika, what was then colonial Tanganyika. And I fell into a few habits during that time. I guess one habit was I really never read carefully the minutes or marginalia. Occasionally the minutes if they were typed. I'm a lazy 20th century historian. But by and large, I didn't find the sort of payoff of reading handwritten minutes except in cases like constitutional negotiations, cases where internal thought in the colonial office was actually relevant or important. Generally, I fell out of the habit of spending time in Kew reading minutes and marginalia. When the Hanslope Park archives became public, I came to realize pretty quickly that really is where the goldmine of information is. It is in recreating kind of office discussions of what were, of course, an office of the special branch, the governors, the secretariat in Dar es Salaam, not sort of removed constitutional negotiations in London, but rather very practical discussions about managing, much of the special branch and Hanslope Park archives for Tanganyika referred to the rise of TANU, the main nationalist movement. And it was very practical questions about strategy, tactics, how to get information, and of course, to get to the question of the special branch, exactly what sorts of methods did they use to get information. And reading closely those archives, you find some of this. Some of it's quite conventional. A few phone intercepts, although telephones weren't widely used in 1950s Tanganyika as a method of communication among African nationalist leaders. Letter intercepts. But then, of course, most interesting to me is informants, right? People on the inside who would acquire, sensitive documentation and bring it to the attention of special branch. So that was my initial interest. And reading through it, it changed my picture of the late colonial British government in Tanganyika. In particular, Edward Twining, who was the governor, was a far more kind of violent-minded person than I had ever thought before. He had all kinds of plans, then this emerges in the minutes and marginalia, to essentially decapitate the leadership through a series of mass arrests that he is pushing for in 1957, 1958, when he's relieved of duty and replaced by Richard Turnbull. None of this comes to pass, so this is mainly a state of mind rather than a series of events, but that was a really quite surprising discovery I had. The other general surprising discovery was the amount of attention and information that the special branch files of Tanganyika had towards the finances of the Tanganyika African National Union, or TANU. This was really quite revelatory. I thought initially it was because they had access to bank information. It turns out actually they had to struggle to get cooperation with local chartered banks, but they were very systematic in terms of their accounting, knowing how much money TANU had in its accounts, who owed money to whom, which vendors were pressing for debt. And I think that there's a whole story of kind of financing of nationalist parties that this group of records really shines a lot of light on. I've not written on that yet myself. It's a little part of the biography I'm writing on a man named Oscar Cambona, but I think generally speaking, the financial dimension that these special branch records produces is really eye-opening. That was something genuinely new and genuinely exciting. So what I want to do, just to kind of give you a sense of how I've specifically used them. As I've said, I've generated an article on this man named Dennis Pombeya, originally, as I said, from Malawi. In the early 1950s, he finds himself in Dar es Salaam as a pretty important political actor. He is the 5th member of TANU, Tanganyika African National Union, that's formed in 1954. And before then, he was a very important actor, owing largely to his social connections. He was the director of what's called Arnatoglu Hall, which is the main social center in Dar es Salaam. He had created a really quite substantial social network, which he transformed into a political network, and in general was, in 1954, 1955, kind of one of the founding figures of this nationalist party. And most such founding figures, went on to sort of very illustrious, or at least semi-illustrious careers in Tanzania itself, because they were sort of, the original people who took the challenge to the colonial government. Denis Pombeya took a very different path. And what I want to do is just read a very short section, I hope this isn't too tedious, from the article I've just published to show how part of his story I was able to extract from those kind of tedious minutes, those tedious handwritten minutes that are in a couple of these special branch files. And that has to do with how Denis Pombeya went from being an officer of the Tanganyika African National Union to being a student who would actually spend the next 10 years studying first in Yugoslavia, and then for most of the time actually in the UK, mainly in London. So I'll just read this. This is sort of the finished material I had specifically from Hanslope Park archives. So competition for African students had emerged as a prime site of Cold War rivalry by the mid-1950s. Scholarships from the Burma-based Asian Socialist Conference to study in Yugoslavia became available in late 1954 for TANU, the Nationalist Party, to allocate, which provided the party with a powerful benefice from which education and travel could be distributed to incumbent leaders as well as to a growing student clientage. In April 1955, 3 members of TANU, Oscar Kambona, who's a person who I'm writing a biography of, Joel Ngogo, who would later come on to be a major newspaper editor in Tanzania, and Denis Pombeya were offered and accepted scholarships for 6 months of study in Yugoslavia. With TANU supplying transportation costs, the only remaining barrier was to acquire valid travel documents. A long discussion ensued within Tanganyika's security apparatus. These are the files. About whether to issue passports and thus facilitate their passage to the Eastern Bloc, or to deny passports and risk sending them underground by encouraging illegal travel out of the territory. Pombeya immediately applied for a passport, but had difficulty in obtaining proof of birth owing to his Nyasaland origins. His father had died when he was young, and his mother was unreachable, living somewhere in Mozambique. On April 16th, one Secretariat official feared that there were no legal grounds for denying Kambona and Mgogo a passport, the other two, but hoped that Pombeya's difficulty in obtaining proof of birth would delay him sufficiently to miss the start of term. So they had the luxury of a kind of bureaucratic hurdle, essentially. Pombeya's fortunes radically changed over the following 2 weeks. On April 20th, he somehow managed to obtain the necessary affidavit to prove his nationality status, which actually was not Nyasaland, but subsequent paperwork would show it was a British protected person of Tanganyika. How did he get that? A week later, Special Branch reported to the Secretariat that Denis Pombeya has now been issued with a passport. Kambona, in contrast, struggled for months to obtain his passport for travel to Yugoslavia, as he secured additional scholarships to extend his studies in the Eastern Bloc and made arrangements actually to escape Tanganyika illegally via Congo. Kambona's passport was finally issued at the end of the year in 55, only after Governor Twining had arranged a colonial student scholarship for him to study not in Yugoslavia, of course, but in London. By this time, Pombeya had already finished his trade union course at Zagreb University in Yugoslavia and was starting another course at Furcroft College in Birmingham. So what that sort of small portion, which is extracted entirely from minutes of a special branch file, shows fairly clearly and is vindicated essentially by a later indiscreet note that Governor Twining himself writes to Lennox Boyd, is that Denis Pombeya essentially received a passport in return for working as an informant for the special branch. So that sort of forms the foundation for much of the rest of the article. It is never a sort of identification that appears easily, which is why it took a lot of work for me to sort of extract that. It's not the sort of thing that I assume in files that are redacted where there's more identifying talk of informants, that those naturally should be taken out or classified. But it shows kind of in the case of Denis Pombeya, it showed one particular tactic that the colonial government used, which was to use the tactic of using their leverage of travel documents, which is a really important part of understanding mobility in the post-World War II decolonization era, to use that in exchange to gain information. So that's what I took out of that article. And I guess sort of the thing I'm also interested in is how that work with the special branch relates to the sort of home office of MI5. And that is that there, later on in the article, it goes into some detail about how informants for MI5 themselves operate. And I make the argument, which I think is pretty strong, that Pombé himself would later become an informant for MI5, and that this essentially, part of this is borne out by some of the correspondence that went on between MI5 and the Special Branch Office back in Dar es Salaam. And one final small point I will mention. So the article is called The Secret Lives of Dennis Pombé. This is just a small snippet of it, but these files, the Hanslope Park archives, were absolutely vital for that. I couldn't have done it without it. But one other point I think that's also very interesting, the final thing I'll say, is that there was a separate line of communication between London and the colonial governments. Conventionally speaking, communication is supposed to be monopolized between the governor and the colonial secretary. That's sort of the way in which colonial governments were structured. And there's a lot of really important implications that come out of that. There is an important exception to that, and that is that special branch were allowed to communicate with MI5 through an office that was known as the Security Liaison Officer, or the SLO. And this is true across the British Empire. And a lot of the subsequent kind of information that I use in my article actually comes from some back and forth that is negotiated through the Security Liaison Officer. And so the final point I will say is that the special branch, read alongside the few but quite interesting MI5 files that have been released, offer that second window of colonial metropolitan communication, which is, as I said, primarily done through the Office of the Security Liaison Officer. So I don't want to speak too much more. I definitely want to save time for a conversation about this, but I'll just leave it there to give you a sense of what I found quite useful with these really quite interesting files that have come from Hanslope Park. Thank you.
It's absolutely fascinating, Jim. You know, I'd recommend that people go back to your article, which is now out. I mean, it's really interesting how, you know, gradually by accretions from the MI5 files themselves and from the migrated archives, we're starting to understand more about how the security liaison officer worked and those links between London and the colonial governments. And, you know, I sort of remember right back to, you know, the early 2000s, you know, finding stuff on Dennis de Quehen in the Walensky papers in Oxford. And, you know, that really casting a light on something that just wasn't there in the National Archives at that point. Increasingly it is. So it's really fascinating stuff. Russell, over to you to talk about a slightly different.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, my work has mostly focused on, it's a comparative study that I've been working on for the last few years. I started in 2016, and this research formed the body of my PhD thesis, and the subsequent research I've been doing since then. I really have more of my backing in history of medicine. So I was curious about instances where doctors, medical professionals got involved in acts of violence as opposed to kind of structural violence, where we know from colonial medicine in the past where they supported structures. I actually wanted to know what happens in instances where doctors were personally involved in interrogation and other forms of violence. So the thesis I put together was actually a cross-comparative study that looked into the role of medical professionals, especially doctors, and the role they played in respect to the counterinsurgency activities in British Kenya and French Algeria in the 1950s and the early 1960s. So the work was split across those two contexts. And by focusing on these professionals and other related scientific experts, so their interaction with sociologists and anthropologists, The work drew attention to a range of underexplored features of these two colonies during their respective wars of independence. And it really drew into attention the ways that and the extent to which medical practitioners and the institution of medicine contributed to or supported the perpetration of violence, especially torture, by European security forces and settler communities during these conflicts. So in short, the release of the Migrated Archives allows us to address this gap that we've had in historical record, that today there has been a remarkably little cogent and sustained historical analysis on the ways that medical professionals can interact with and support the perpetration of actual violence itself. So I chose to compare these two contexts because they're substantially contemporaneous. The war in Algeria just followed the start of the Mau Mau uprising and continued only a year or two after. So they're, in terms of a timeline, they are very, very closely connected. Both were set in the colonies, and both saw politically dominant settler communities involve themselves in the counterinsurgency activities to differing degrees. Both the British and French governments refused to identify these conflicts as official wars, as we know, preferring to refer to them as rebellions or tribal struggles. And they issued the emergency regulations, which gave them extraordinary powers for detention, and which allowed then the forms of violence we understand, summary executions, disappearances, torture, rape, and other forms of human rights violations to take place. But above all, it was also the reliance on the detention centres that formed the kind of focus within this work. The reason I wanted to compare these two in this study was that it raised similar questions around the concealment of evidence. So as we're talking about the Migrated Archives, France also went to great extent to cover up its archival information regarding these the war more generally, and that was released in the 1990s, the late 1990s, and brought about within France a kind of large debate and soul-searching question about its historical legacy of empire. So the two married together very well. So the prior to having the Migrated Archives, and this is one of the reasons why this is such a substantial kind of cache of documents for this work. Prior to that, we had a very, very limited idea of how doctors actually participated within the emergency itself. So one of the things that struck me very early on is that if you read the memoirs of doctors, medical officers who operated within Kenya in the years preceding the emergency and went on through to independence, the moment they get to the 1950s, they stop writing or they gloss over it in very few words. So you don't ever actually get any larger reflections on the medical involvement or their own perceptions of what took place during the emergency in Kenya. So from the records we had within Kew and within Kenya itself, we could piece together a very, very limited image of what medicine and health within the detention centres actually looked like prior to that. And we generally got the conclusion that they were sites of disease, that they were unhygienic, very limited in terms of the actual medical facilities and provisions that they actually had to extend to detainees. They were probably in isolated locations where malaria was a common problem, dysentery, typhoid, and other illnesses associated with insanitary conditions were very, very common. A kind of illustrative example would be the typhoid epidemic that took place in 1954, which swept through the Manyani camp and moved on to surrounding detention centres after Operation Anvil increased the number of detainees. So we had that image, but we didn't really see how doctors participated in violence itself. And when the Migrated Archives came along and the initial research that came out from their release, work done by Caroline Elkins, David Anderson, A.R. Bagley, and Catherine Bruce Lockhart, we started to get more of an image, more of a focus on the actual allegations surrounding torture, abuse, and these other treatments. And at this point, we start to see names of doctors starting to come into the picture. and we start to get correspondences between officials and medical officers to piece together their involvement, which has actually been, to this point, been very, very shadowy within this story. And then this kind of gave me the impetus for starting my work. And so from this, we actually find out that, generally speaking, whenever abuse, violence and torture did take place within the Kenya emergencies, again, generally speaking, doctors were never too far away from the sites that these activities took place. They are in and around the violence themselves, in some ways more tacitly than others. Within the detention camps, doctors appeared to perform several important tasks that are common to both Kenya and Algeria, as well as other more recent contexts where doctors have been assisted with counterinsurgency violence, such as British and American forces in Iraq and Afghanistan during the War on Terror. So the activities they're involved in can be understood as either passive or active forms of collusion, and include, but are not limited necessarily, to violating the professional confidence of the doctor-patient relationship by providing medical information to security staff. They have worked with in relation to the implementation of the notorious dilution technique. They help to evaluate the victim's capacity to withstand beatings prior to undergoing that treatment. They also provided medical treatment to victims who had health complications after they'd received this type of treatment. They're also involved in what seems to be falsifying autopsy reports or pathology reports, or providing false diagnosis in order to hide the evidence of torture. This is particularly come about through the Migrated archives. This is something we see very keenly within this work, where allegations of abuse are rarely followed forward because of problems with the medical evidence, or the information is recorded at a slow rate so that the police can't actually follow up on any of the allegations. And finally, they also, as I say, kind of failed to report signs or to take seriously the evidence of abuse within the detention centres when they were called in to examine it. Now, although these practices were common to both sets of doctors in Kenya and Algeria, there are valuable differences between the two contexts, both in terms of the extent at which they participated and in the ways that they did not. There is also no evidence that British doctors in Kenya attempted any brave interventions, like scientifically sophisticated means to force confessions from Mau Mau detainees or suspects. This is an important point of contrast with the situation in Algeria, where actually doctors took it upon themselves to actually get involved in interrogation itself, and used the so-called truth drug to extract operative information from terrorist suspects. So we don't actually see doctors in Kenya getting involved in the situation. They play this role in the background where they kind of support the actions of and the administration of violence. And it was actually written into the regulations that a doctor should be present, as I say, prior to the use of the dilution technique. So this adds to this wider idea that we're finding that the experts, the so-called experts within the detention centre, were not scientific experts. The expertise within these facilities are actually the police wardens, security wardens, who believed they had the answers to how to extract information. Whereas, as I say, the medical community in Kenya in particular simply assisted to add a kind of a veneer of professionalism to the activities of punitive violence, basically. So I will probably leave it there, because I want to go into more detail in the actual discussions, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Russell. That's, again, absolutely fascinating. And can I just invite people, Russell mentioned the discussion afterwards. We've got until 6 o'clock, so there's plenty of time for discussion. But please do, in the meantime, if you'd like me to bring you in, just type in chat, I'd like to speak, Philip. Or if you'd like to put a question via chat, please do so. You don't have to wait until the end, because as I say, I'll feed them into the discussion. Without further ado, let me invite Caroline Elkins. Thank you so much for joining us, Caroline, and over to you.
My pleasure, Philip, and thank you and the entire team for organizing this, for having me here today. It's such a privilege, and to come after Mandy and Jim and Russell. I so enjoyed your presentations, and it's it's just amazing to hear colleagues speak in these kinds of fora, because I think, as you're gesturing to, Philip, it allows us to hear about the exciting new ways in which the fields are moving all at once. So thank you for that. What I'd like to do is to frame my remarks somewhat temporally today, and think about the significance, at least in my own mind, as Philip, you approached me about this, of sort of in broad terms about the significance of the Hanslope Park papers, both sort of past, present, and future, if you will. And so if we look to the past, that takes us back to the point at which these files came to light, which was, of course, in the context of the Moul case in London's High Court, which, as we all know, that case was filed in the spring of 2009 with the claimants alleging, if you will, systematic violence and torture in Kenya from, and I think it's important, from 1954 to 1960, and in the initial pleading asking for damages for a variety of things. And in its defense, the FCO, as we also know, sought to strike the case out twice, right? The first one, in some ways, Mandy, you gestured to a little bit in your remarks, and I'll come to. The first had to do with the questions of state succession and the passage of liability from the government in Britain to that in Kenya. And that was heard first in April 2011. And a claim that Justice McComb, while Mandy said, sort of upheld, but he did in part. In other words, he also opened to the door to the question of vicarious liability and duty of care. And that is why, in some ways, the transfer of documents to Kenya is different from the transfer of liability, right? And in some ways, when we think about vicarious liability and duty of care, the case was really, I mean, it was a tort case, right? It was a case that was one big personal injury suit. And so unlike, say, the Cypriot case that came in front of the European Commission, Human Rights, when Greece brought Britain up for that twice, that this was not a case about whether or not this was a question of human rights, violation of international human rights. This was a case about duty of care. And in some ways, holding the empire, in this case Britain, in this particular moment in time in Kenya, up to its own standards of professed civilizing mission, right? So the second strikeout attempt then, which was heard in July of 2012, centered on the issue of statute of limitations, which was really by many considered to be the very high watermark of the case. Most, in many cases, the statute of limitations is not waived, and the claimants had 3 years to file their claim, and given that 50 years had passed, the FCO was saying that the case should be stricken out because Her Majesty's government could in no way receive a fair trial some 50 years after the events. Now, both I and Dave and Hugh were brought on board by Lee Day, which I think was a wonderful moment and an example of sort of what historical collaboration can do. We had the range of expertise that we brought to bear in the case of the claimant's case. And as we also know, in the weeks prior to, just before that first strikeout hearing on state succession and liability, the Hanslope Park disclosure came to light. And so therefore, it was not until after the first strikeout hearing that we really dug into these files. Now, at this point, in many ways, so when the Justice McComb rules on the first round of evidence, if you will, for the first strikeout, he also has to rule on whether or not this is a frivolous claim, right? Whether or not there's even enough evidence for this to go to fair trial, regardless of whether or not there's an issue for a strikeout. So we had to produce what were sort of, compressed versions of our historical research. And in my case, it was about Imperial Reckoning was sort of reduced down to about 80 pages. I'm sure that Dave and Hugh did similar kinds of things. And the judge was quite clear that at that point, prior to the analysis of the Hanslope disclosure, there was more than enough evidence in the historical record outside of whatever came out of Hanslope for this case to go forward. Insofar as the knowledge of both governments that torture was happening and the failure to take effective measures to stop it. So from there, we go to the Hanslope Park and files. And here again, we were given access to a searchable database, which the FCO uploaded the documents onto, right? And they had the ability to both cull the evidence for purposes of national security and what they determined to be relevancy. And so there was a considerable amount of back and forth as historians asked for files. The FCO wouldn't give it. We had to go to the court to compel them, and that many of these documents never saw the light of day because the case ended up settling before then. But if I were to look back and think about these witness statements, and they were quite considerable. I mean, mine was a couple hundred pages with new evidence, and then several combined thousands of pages of new files. And in many ways, I have to say, and this in some ways too gets to your point, Mandy, there was the feeling held by, I can only speak for myself, that there was no guarantee that what we saw as expert witnesses would actually make it into the archive as the migrated documents, right? And in fact, right now it would take, I suspect, a graduate student or somebody a lot of time to compare the original file reference numbers to the new file reference numbers to the FCO to see if everything that I saw is what everybody else is seeing in the archives today. And I actually made a copy of everything that I saw. It's sitting in a basement somewhere in the Harvard archives. And when I get the money together to digitize them, I like to hand them over to somebody. But nevertheless, in my mind at that point, the only new or previously unseen evidence that potentially changed, and this is important, the merits of the case pertain to the documents about document destruction, right? And these were among the very first files that the FCO released to us, and they chronicled the highly systematized process of document destruction, which we had some inclination of, but really had no sense of the bureaucratization of detail, who was involved, all the way up to the Colonial Secretary, and the removal and destruction of these files, which became clear from what we saw that there was 3.5 tons of files slated to be incinerated in Kenya. Now, the FCO attempted to turn its selection release of the files to its advantage when it claimed that given the scale of the document destruction, and that the document destruction was, according to the FCO, ordered from London, but taken too far by officials in Kenya, that it meant that the British government couldn't have a fair trial, because possibly in those files were remaining evidence that would have exonerated the FCO in the here and now. And when you think about this, I mean, sort of put another way, it was officials acting in the right of Kenya, not those acting in the right of Britain, who took document destruction too far, who also executed policies of abuse and torture. And when you think about historical patterns, this is not unlike how they explained Hola. This isn't unlike, even if we go all the way back to Amritsar, how even Churchill dealt with General Dyer, right? So in the end, of course, Macomb waives the statute of limitations, and we know sort of how the story ends. The British government settles things up. Now, insofar as the Hanslope disclosure was significant to the Mull case, I think it's in the bigger picture that I think it's important to keep in mind that archives, in this case, the Hanslope disclosure, are, in my own mind, as I think about it, sort of one of the ways in which liberalism does its work, right? Or we can even expand that to think about the ways in which liberal imperialism continues to do its work. And that is both at the time of empire and in the construction of its archives, liberal imperialism is both emancipatory and repressive, and it has the means to both, if you will, illuminate and obfuscate at the same time. And so we understand the archives, I think, in that sense, in a kind of double bookkeeping that's embedded as it is through this destruction and selective process release. And I think, moreover, in many ways, the assessing Hanslope Park's significance can be seen as an analog to understanding colonial violence writ large. And that is, it's precisely because liberal imperialism has this reformist impulse, and one that could be borne out in things like Hearts and Minds, regardless of how lackluster it was, that renders claims about colonial violence so difficult in some ways to make stick, together with questions of who was doing what to whom. And I'll come back to that. Or in the FCO's terms, in the Mau case, who was acting in the right of Kenya and who was acting in right of Britain. So in the same way, assessing Hanslope Park's significance is challenging, I think, in some instances, precisely because it resulted in a massive release of new evidence in the form of the migrated archives. But, you know, I think we have to bear in mind that this broader liberal imperial impulse is constantly at work, right? And that's why I'm saying I think it's useful, and I'm sort of going to move on to other things. I've discussed this in some articles I've written, but to be thinking about these documents as an analog and to be reading it within the larger context of colonial violence in the state itself. Now, turning to the present, I have to say just off the top, we'd be here forever if I went through all the really excellent work that's been produced since the Mau case. The field is really quite amazing. And, you know, I think that some of that work sort of maybe got out over its skis a little bit in terms of understanding the significance of Hanslope Park, as it was published sort of right at that time when all this stuff came out. And others really sort of read the evidence alongside the evidence that had been existing. But nevertheless, I really want to underscore the degree to which I personally feel indebted to the kind of work that's being done, as I myself am finishing up a very large book, because Lord knows I can't get away from questions about violence, that really looks at liberal imperialism from the Hastings trial to the Mau trial, and trying to understand these long currents and long durée of various forms of what I think about as logics of violence. And so in this way, I like to sort of, by example, point to three different sort of interrelated areas of research that at least are, I hate to be so self-referential, of interest to me right now in some of my writing. The first, of course, is around other counterinsurgencies. And if we hold the work on Malaya against that of Cyprus, I think there's some significant differences, not in terms of obviously the quality of the work of the historians, which is incredible, but in relationship to Hanslope Park. And that is, in the case of Malaya, there isn't a whole lot that's new in Hanslope Park. And, you know, I think this has to do, especially for the early part of the war, in other words, when Gurney was High Commissioner from 48 to 51, and really up and through until 54. In part, I would suggest because the FCO had no anticipatory legal reason to release the documents, right? And I say this because there's a statute that prevents any case like that of the Mau from being filed for events prior to 1954. That's why the Mau case was from 54 to 1960 and not 1952 to 1960 from the start of the emergency. However, the Cyprus and Aden examples are a bit different in that they pertain to events post-1954, and here there are more files on abuse, though far more limited than the Kenyan case because there was not the full weight of the court behind it. And this said, much like the Mau case, they don't necessarily change so much the big picture that was already in historical evidence. And I think that David French has spoken this quite eloquently in terms of the release of his book on Cyprus, which was so important. And, you know, obviously there are other works that have been out there, Simpson's work, Human Rights and Empire, and obviously the evidence in other archives. However, they do offer up, and these are sort of gesture to the other two speakers, to really significant details on precisely who was doing what, right? And the nature of the cover-ups, the opinions of officials on the ground and in London, and that's really, that's important. Now, the second area of research, and this has been touched on too, is absolutely around MI5's role in colonial violence, the collection of intelligence and torture during an interrogation. And if one wants to understand the nature of colonial violence, you must understand the nature of MI5 and Empire, period. That's my personal view. And some of this requires, and what's interesting, and Jim, you pointed to this a little bit in sort of how you were reading the files, that I think the Hanslope disclosure is exceedingly important insofar as there are fragments of evidence that really only become apparent if you know what you're looking for. Right? So a name might be mentioned, a particular location might be mentioned. And so it really is this kind of mosaic pattern of putting together history. And, I think, put another way, the history of interrogation in empire is also the history of MI5's proliferation and circulation through various interrogation sites, which were known as combined service detailed interrogation centers, or better known as CISDICs. And these CISDICs become very important, and they were launched during the Second World War. Again, Simpson talks about this in his book, Camp 020. There's a very different version of CISDIC in some of the, if you will, official histories of MI5. And what I would suggest is actually, if we look not only in the institutions, so there were, getting back to the Hanslope Park files, we can find in Malaya the CISDIC that's created there. We can find the ones that are obviously that we knew of in Aden at Fort Morbut and others. We can also trace individuals, whether it's the sort of legendary Tin-Eye Stevens, Dick White, Jack Morton, Alex Keller, John Prendergast. I think sort of getting to some of the points that you were making, Jim, when I think about Tanganyika, which was obviously not a site of counterinsurgency, but Turnbull, who is the governor there, worked in Kenya and was great friends with Prendergast, who was director of intelligence in the CISDIC, which was known as the Mau Mau Interrogation Center. They eventually come back together in Aden, where Prendergast is also the director of intelligence, and Turnbull is in charge. And of course, these CISDICs were MI5 operations, and also a special branch. It's not a surprise as sort of direct conduit, because in effect, in my own head, special branch is being run by MI5 in many of these counterinsurgency locations, whether de facto or in practice. And so I think in that sense, for me, in terms of my own work, these files have been incredibly useful. Although I'm not looking to write a history, sort of a renewed history of sort of MI5, it's kind of one strain through the logics of violence. But I think there's an enormous opportunity there to understand the relationship between intelligence and counterinsurgencies, and also why, when I go back to our work with the Hanslope Park disclosure, as it was called back in the context of the case, the British government, or the FCO, was so deeply resistant to releasing to us certain documents, and in the process of having the settlement, any requests that we maintained for documents went away. And the last area of research I'd like to gesture to is that on Kenya. And, here there's just been some, again, marvelous work on the case. Russell, I'm really excited about the work that you're doing. I think it's deeply important. I'm eager to learn more. I certainly, in the context of my work, didn't hear a whole lot from interviews and the rest about doctors. I do wonder why they might not have been whistleblowers if they were so present. I also wouldn't put it past the FCO to release lots and lots of files on doctors showing, which they tried to do, that they were upholding their duty of care, even in these camps, right? That said, it was an area that I did not get all that into, and I think it's one that's crying out for the kind of work that you're doing. But I would gesture to also just in sort of big picture that the Hanslope documents are extremely important, but as there's no doubt, but to suggest that we only really, if you will, knew about certain things because they were released in the FCO files really becomes a bit of a red herring. And I think this was raised by Phil earlier on, and I think Philip earlier on, and I think the field in general has moved well beyond this. And that is sort of, we're going to get into a very difficult, if anything, this process has shown to us that if we sort of get into the direction, or sort of the hanging on and the fetishizing of documents, it's going to be a challenge, right? And it's going to be, the need to read together multiple sources of evidence, along with, I can say from my own work what political theorists have been doing on liberal imperialism and violence more generally, whether it's, Mehta and Brennan and Jennifer Pitts working on issues of liberal imperialism, to people like Sofsky and others, and some of the classics working on violence. I think these do open doors for us in thinking about how to read some of this evidence in new and different ways. And it's that, and I'm sort of going to wrap up here, but it's at that point that I'd like to just sort of gesture to sort of as we look ahead, sort of building on that. And that is, if we place the Hanslope disclosure within that broader framework, as I keep saying, of liberal imperialisms, kind of ability to illuminate and obfuscate, then the documents it contains are deeply, deeply useful, even if they're coming in these kinds of fragments. And not only are the processes through which they were discovered and disclosed reflective of the ways in which liberalism does its work, but they're also helpful in suggesting to us that the ways in which we need to think about the disclosure alongside other evidence and toolkits at our disposal. And I think, if I were even to put it another way, liberalism, I think, very much has the ability to consistently, over time, reinvent itself, right? It's highly elastic, say, unlike, if we're thinking about fascist empires by comparison, which is often thrown up and certainly thrown up in the current day. And this is borne out, for example, if we even look at liberalism's lexicon, right? Ranging from, we move from Caldwell's moral effect, becoming in the 1950s rehabilitation. It's more or less the same thing, right? And trusteeship evolving into what is in the post-war period called partnership. And even if we look at it, the Hanslope disclosure, with its legal connotation so clear, a disclosure, became the migrated archive, suggesting through passive voice some kind of benign movement and transparency. A point which in and of itself was driven home in the words of Foreign Secretary Haig himself when these disclosures came to light. And the point is, liberal imperialism and its civilizing mission is a process that emerged in the 19th century, and Hanslope disclosure is just part of this process, right? It's one element if we read it into the longue durée. And I think this needs to just remain in future mind as we dip into the files for empirical purposes. And you, both Jim and Russell, gave us fantastic examples of what that looks like. And also consider the ways in which we can sort of open our temporal lenses to read important fragments of evidence in this very long durée of violence and empire. And it's a long durée, I'd suggest, that includes the Hanslope disclosure as both an historical actor and a repository of its own evidence. And so I have said enough. I'll stop there. But most of all, my thanks again to Philip for having us all here, and I'm looking forward to having some time for discussion.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Caroline. And we've covered an awful lot of ground. I've got a series of questions have come in via chat, and I'll go through the questions systematically. And if speakers could be fairly concise in the way that you answer them, and then we'll have time to get through everything. But there was one, not so much a question as Tom McGuire. Tom, if you can get ready to come in, you said that you've done some work yourself on the Malayan Singaporean FCO 141 files, and Caroline mentioned. I mean, it seemed when they were initially released, the Malayan files were a bit thin, but maybe just if you could summarize just in 2 or 3 minutes what your impressions of the files were and how those chime with what other people have said.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Philip. I should add as well that I dipped into some of the Tanganyikan stuff, like Jim did, for an article in the same special issue as Jim's as well. But he covered basically all the grounds on that side of things. So I'll stick to the work I've been doing on Singapore and Malaya. And just to summarize kind of what I found useful, what I found still missing, and maybe the wider connections of those, what's in those files with other stuff that's recently come out at Q. So firstly, on what I found useful, I would concur with what Caroline said, related to the fact that there wasn't much there on the violence and abuse side of things, certainly. So, for example, what wasn't there was anything to do, any reporting, interrogation reports or processes from the Malayan Holding Centre, which is the equivalent of the CISDIC that Caroline mentioned. Interestingly though, in terms of MI5's relationship there, what comes out from the FCO 141 files and some of the KV series, MI5's own series at Q, is a running battle to try and actually gain any influence or access to the holding centre. So senior special branch officers actually being reluctant to allow MI5 liaison officers or even secondees direct access to the holding centre until about 1955. So about 7 years into the emergency. It seemed they were rightly, I guess, regarded it as being the most sensitive aspect of the apparatus there in Malaya, not just because it was used for interrogations, but because it was also being used for communications interceptions as well. But what I found useful in the series, they give very good insights into kind of the basic processes of the Malayan and Singaporean special branch and police, including some of the demographics of the institutions. Very good kind of if you're willing to wade through weekly and fortnightly intelligence reporting. Very good insights into who was being monitored and why, and some of the assumptions inbuilt into that monitoring, which you can kind of build out of the analytical assumptions and conclusions that were being made. There's a lot of stuff in those files on internal propaganda as well. So efforts to actually try and influence populations within the colonies and some of the tensions within government about the propriety of that. Processes involved in that, some of the images and assumptions that were being conveyed regarding indigenous populations. Very useful in terms of the place of the Malayan and Singaporean institutions in terms of international relations as well, because of the perceived British utility of those institutions in terms of regional intelligence and security networks. So you get insights into Thais, Laotians, Vietnamese coming to train in Malayan and Singaporean institutions, and so you get kind of insights into not quite south-south connections, but the kind of the early stages of those kind of interactions within the region, which I found quite interesting. What is still missing? So some of the security liaison officer files are still retained. All files related to the presence of CIA officers towards the back end of the colonies as they were transitioning to empire still retained. Nothing to do with communications security. So obviously there's been stories in the Washington Post in the last few months pre-lockdown regarding efforts to pass on communications security, which were highly compromised after independence in a number of states. So there's no reference to kind of a British handing over communication security to newly independent states, and no raw interrogation or informant reporting either. So it's just the kind of the processed material that's in there. Final comment, the wider connections that I found between the FCO 141 series and what else is in queue. Obviously, back in 2007, in the Colonial Office series, there was the 1035 series that got released regarding their intelligence and security department, which was updated again in 2017. And so if you put those two files together, you can start to create some of these international networks to a greater extent than we could before. And then just this year, in the CRO series, so Commonwealth Relations Office series, there was a file series, DO231, related to a department which we now know exists, which we didn't know, had been hinted at before, which we now know exists, which was the Intelligence and Security Department within the Commonwealth Relations Office. And why that's very useful for matching up with these FCO 141 series is on this question of transitioning to post-independence. So what happened next, basically, trying to follow some of these themes through to how Britain in these international networks tried to retain relations and influence within these institutions, and the extent to which they continue to try and intervene. Now, a lot of this series is still heavily retained, and so is, I'd say, open for FOI requests for years to come.
I think
so that's what I found.
Yeah, thank you for that's a very succinct and helpful overview, and I think we might invite you back to give us some more information there. I'll start to go through the questions that people have posed on chat. The first one I can see came from my colleague Sue Onslow, and it's addressed to Russell, and it's about the medical professionals. And Sue says, can you differentiate between Army Medical Corps, white settler medics, expatriate doctors, the medical fraternity back in the UK, I guess in terms of the complicity in abuses? And I mean, that a very just a question of pure curiosity. I know when I was writing my biography of Lennox Boyd, it seemed fairly clear from the very incomplete sources that there was some fairly major cover-up in Manyani camp. That prisoners who'd been beaten to death, those deaths were dismissed as having been due to typhoid, which of course has echoes of the Holocamp massacre. So perhaps Russell, if you could answer both those questions.
Yeah, sure. I mean, they're actually very useful questions because they help us really map out the exchange of information, knowledge passed from the professionals, and the extent to which different professionals and different backgrounds are actually involved. So you see this changing as the emergency moves on. So in the early stages of the emergency, a lot of the individuals you're seeing involved are settler doctors. In fact, I found it quite a curious phenomena that among the first targets of Mau Mau violence were actually doctors themselves, which was an interesting outcome. So there was something specific about this. And a lot of some of the more prominent settlers were actual doctors as well. And they voiced their own opinions on how the government actually responded to the violence in the early stages. As we move on into the past about 1956 is when you start to see medical officers employed specifically by the British government. They start to become more predominant. But as I say, in those earlier stages where violence wasn't necessarily just taking place within the detention centres, but were also in police stations and other improvised areas for interrogation, you have a whole range of medical experts coming in, including missionary doctors who are brought in to examine allegations of abuse, to examine bodies of detainees who have been killed. And as I kind of said in my very, very quick whistle-stop tour of my thesis, in many cases, the information they gave was very, very limited. They kept very descriptive information, very functional information, and wouldn't comment, always refused to comment on the extent to which they believed this was a sign of evidence. They'd simply say what they saw. And this played into the hands, in terms of when we're talking about cover-up, this played into the hands of the government quite well, because they refused to give a determined position on what they saw this evidence meaning. It allowed another narrative to be superimposed on top of it. This actually led to a point in the House of Parliament, House of Commons, in the 24th of February 1959, I think it was, when the MP from Northampton actually raised this question about abuses when it was being investigated. They actually said that something like, this is the sixth case I know of where the medical expert hasn't been able to draw a conclusion. And as a consequence, the government has been able to say, well, because the bullet went through the heart of the individual in question, we can't tell whether or not he had actually died at the same time of a heart complication prior to the bullet penetrating him. And so you have this very, very messy situation taking place where the silence of the medical community actually contributes, willingly otherwise. To this extent, I still don't know. My mind isn't made up on this, to what extent the silence was a deliberate attempt to assist with the cover-up or a fear of getting involved themselves. In terms of, I see on Sue's question, in terms of medical objections, and I think this comes into what Caroline said, I haven't encountered anybody who spoke up. I haven't seen anybody who actually spoke up against the situation taking place in the camps. But at the same time, when detainees wrote letters two MPs and they got smuggled out of the camps. They don't ever point their finger at doctors at all. So doctors remain constantly very, very shadowy figures, which, as I say, contrasts massively with the situation in Algeria, where you have doctors getting very much hands-on with the interrogation and the counterinsurgency activities themselves. So this question around cover-up becomes more difficult, and I ask questions about to what extent did doctors have the full picture? To what extent did they understand the extent to which violence was taking place in camps, or were they brought in under specific circumstances, shown the individuals they needed to see, and then ushered back out? If you examine the, as you said, the Holler camp incident, that's when you start to see a bigger story of the doctors being more involved. And it's the first time I've seen a doctor, Dr. Moyes, who was the first doctor involved, who actually lived at the camp himself, becoming more implicated in the actual cover-ups itself. And I think Barbara Castle actually draws questions at him in a House of Commons debate, asking, why isn't anybody asking more questions about this doctor who doesn't seem to be able to make his mind up between whether or not individuals were beaten to death or drowned, as was a story that was put out by the press in the early stages. So we have this question always in our minds about the extent to which any practitioner had the full picture, and we're just being shown snippets.
Thanks, Russell. I mean, David Killingray talks about his work on the KV files on special branch activities, and he raises a point which I think will be familiar to any of us who worked on intelligence history. So that the data gathered was inaccurate and tended to reinforce the ideas and views held by the security officials. I mean, it's the L point that it's easier to gather intelligence than it is to analyze it intelligently. And often the way in which it's gathered simply reinforces the views of the agents themselves. And we know that from a variety of different national agencies. Jim, could you comment on that, or maybe anyone else who would like to come in after?
Yeah, I could say a couple things about that. First, yeah, there certainly is a fair amount of wishful thinking is probably too strong, but confirmation bias in some of this, in a fair amount of the special branch reports. Some of it I would say is accurate, some of it is inaccurate. And there is in the special branch of Tanganyika occasionally a sense that they are dealing with inaccurate information, so they're not completely clueless about it. I guess I'll say two things on it. The first thing is that, and this is more about the MI5 files. One of the main points of my article is that the biographical subject, Dennis Pombea, a big part of his job was not simply providing information; it was actually providing analysis. It was making sense of the positions that a whole variety of African nationalist actors had and were bringing into London, often during constitutional negotiations. So there is the analytical portion is not wholly monopolized by the intelligence agencies in a way that actually surprised me. So that's the first point. That's one of the major arguments of my article. The second point, and this refers to a question that came up in chat, has to do with the question of language, right? These meetings are in Tanganyika that are being, in some cases, actually recorded by a tape recorder. In other cases, being summarized by sometimes white European agents, other times by African informants, are done in Swahili. And so there is a really critical language, a really critical question of translation. How, and this comes up in some of the special branch files, how do you translate terms that are deemed to be inflammatory to the point of actually law breaking? To what extent can you handle wordplay? To what extent can direct insults in Swahili about various European figures have legal standing based on the question of translation, let alone based on the question of how do you go to court with this as a public record when they initially got it through essentially intelligence through secret means. Well, I'll just say one thing on that. There was an in-house figure in the Tanganyikan political administration, a lovely man who I knew. His name is Randall Sadler. He was essentially a publicity officer for the Tanganyikan government. And he stayed on for about almost 15 years after independence. And he wrote actually quite good memoir. But he was their go-to person because he had really, really good Swahili. He was fluent in Swahili. He would later, for years after, be an interpreter. So there were a lot of kind of makeshift fixes that the colonial government did, but they were certainly aware that language was an issue. Theoretically, if you had been in Tanganyika, you have all these encouragements to pass certain levels of Swahili examinations. In practice, particularly in the special branch, a lot of the figures there had no Swahili or had pretty poor Swahili. So this was a major issue. And what the Migrated Archives, Hanslope archives show is just the tip of the iceberg on that question. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, if I could jump in on that as well, Phil. Yeah. Thank you, Jim. And in some ways, my comments are going to build on yours, and that is, in some ways, I often think of the question of language as sort of a symptom of much larger cultural and institutional voids. And so, therefore, if we think about the fact that repeatedly, stretching back, we can go back to the South African War, right? In many ways, MI5 is a product, and MI6. Of intelligence failures during what was known as the Boer War. And consistently over and over again, there is these emergencies erupt. They're supposed to be 3-month wars. They take everybody by surprise. And what they're reflective of are several things. I mean, first of all, yes, we know that there was financial overstretch in empire and fiscally supporting robust police departments and the rest. There was constantly an understaffing within this. But also most of these colonies, and certainly Cyprus would be among them, Malaya would be among them, didn't even have a special branch before the eruption, before the declaration of the state of emergency, or maybe even just prior to it. And of course, special branch was differentiated because of political policing. And so these wars are consistently characterized as intelligence failures, one after the other after the other. And there's often in the literature this sort of idea of, well, there can't be a model because nobody was learning. Well, the question becomes, it's not a question of not learning, it's a question of whether, through what register are they understanding what they're doing? And so the inability to speak a local language would be sort of a symptom, as I say, and this was recurrent. Nobody spoke Arabic, nobody spoke Hebrew, nobody spoke, Mandarin, nobody spoke Cantonese. You could just kind of go down the list in each single place. And even when they did, the intelligence that came out that was understood through a register that really militated against any deeper understanding beyond local insurgents were being led by Machiavellian leaders, and certainly not within a register of understanding the deep nature of the civil wars that were also unfolding at the same time. And so I think this gets back, and I don't want to sort of keep coming back to big picture, but one has to ask about sort of the overall ideological framework of liberal imperialism and how people understood local populations with whom they were working. And, one can see the most extreme example of these institutional and cultural voids of understanding being brought to bear in special branch, in interrogation, and in abuses. But they were symptomatic of others, right? And even, if we went to Russell's work and looked at how understandings by medical officers were of issues to do with pain and suffering, right? How, if we go back to, Lawrence of Arabia and his influence on how Arabs were understood, they didn't feel pain. And so all of this is connected to each other in many ways, but I do come back to sort of these institutional and cultural voids, of which intelligence was the most dramatic indication of it and its failures. But it's not surprising in the least that even though the same pattern plays out, they never learn. Well, of course they don't learn because it's inherent to the sort of the liberal imperial project to begin with, despite its capacity to reform itself.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions which I'd quite like to run together, and they're again initially for Mandy, but Caroline as well. You might want to come in. So one is in this story, the collaboration between historians, archivists, lawyers, and activists was essential in bringing the Migrated archives to light. How could such a collaboration be reinvigorated to facilitate meaningful archival restitution? I think it's a very good question. And a more specific question I'm wondering if any of the speakers could say how long the formal migration and destruction of records under Operation Legacy continued. Did archival destruction continue in the remaining British colonies in the 70s, 80s, and 90s? Mandy, I mean, what do you think of those?
Well, the first question, I mean, it's a really good point. It needs a collaboration by all those players, the historians, archivists, lawyers, etc., before we are going to get anywhere. And that, I think, is something that's so difficult to maintain. It's possible to bring it together in a one-off conference, but then people go away back to their own lives. And this is something that I'm mainly trying to work on at the moment, which is why I've been talking to a variety of different people. But you know, I mean, it's just so difficult, and without people who have a full-time dedication to these questions, I'm always fearful that there won't be a great deal of progress.
Mm. And on the just that specific question of how long Operation Legacy continued, have you got any senses about how long?
I have no idea, I'm afraid. I have no idea.
No, I mean, I suppose it's one of those very difficult to answer questions. Caroline, do you want to come in on the first point?
Sure. Not on the first one, because I think Mandy spoke to that well.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I think also, you know, experts like Mandy are the people from whom I would take the lead from, right? Helping me understand institutionally how would one make this actually, how would one execute this? I think one thing about Operation Legacy, I'll give you the example in Kenya. So Operation Legacy starts really sort of in 1950s, you know, beginning in 57, they've already begun. But I think one of the things that these files did shed light on, the reason that I'm raising this, is that Operation Legacy kind of happened in two ways. If we sort of think of the files as being a part of the operation. So Terence Gavahan, who was in charge of creating the dilution technique, and who I interviewed many times before he passed on. And he was, you know, aside from the one file that we had, the July 1957 memo found in the National Archives prior to the case, we had no way. Gavahan kind of skated under the radar other than showing up to seminars and kind of spinning his own narrative. But in Kenya, he was responsible for the dilution technique, which becomes the eventual center, one of the centers of the Mau Mau case. He then moves from being chief torturer to chief archivist, which we discover through the Hanslope disclosure, because he's in charge of executing Operation Legacy in the burning of the files and overseeing the selection and destruction process. So in theory, that process ends with decolonization in 63. They have, and they, you know, the Malayan case is probably the more extreme one, where they are racing against the clock. Same thing in India, to get rid of this stuff or do with it is that what they want before the Union Jack comes down. But in Gavahan's case and many others, and this is very true of all the SLOs over empire, of which I do not believe Gavahan was one, but he stays on. And in Operation Legacy, he's in charge of the Africanization program for the now independent Kenyan administration. So therefore, insofar as the continuity between files and influence, Operation Legacy, sort of, if one were looking at this and sort of reading this in the longer durée post-independence, it continues through both, if you will, in this case, Africanization programs, but also the leaving behind of SLOs, security liaison officers, which was a requirement of independence negotiations, and they're all over the place. And so that's also one of the reasons why, you know, as we know, Prime Minister was feeling a little bit better with his Winds of Change speech, knowing full well that, you know, they were going to have strong amount of informal influence without formal power.
Thank you. I mean, Terence Gavahan is such a fascinating figure. I mean, my Caroline Brahm, who's working with me at the moment and is online, is looking at issues around restitution in Kenya and Northern Ireland. And we were talking a lot about Gavahan's Corridors of Wire book, and the kind of the strange psychology behind that need to kind of half confess, but not quite. And Caroline herself asked a question again, really back to Caroline, I think. Caroline says, in many of these potential cases, actual reliable evidence, witness statements, etc., may be dwindling simply due to length of time that's passed. Would that be a significant concern in bringing more tort cases like the Mull case? Mm. And if this evidence may not meet legal evidentiary standards, which could prevent a legal case moving forward, could other mechanisms for finding remedies be more effective in these cases? Mm-hmm. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think the very short answer to this is that in the Mull case, one of the claimants did pass away in the course of the case. Mm-hmm. And the judge was very clear in his ruling that those rights to bring a case did not pass to descendants. And so for the Mull case, there was a real race against the clock as well, that once if the FCA dragged it out, the claimants passed away, the case was gone. And that was a similar issue that I think befell the Cypriot case that came forward. So therefore, future claims without the actual claimants themselves, the people who experienced the abuses, are not possible. Insofar as finding other remedies, I think two things. I think one, I get back to the work that Mandy is doing is so exceedingly important, because for so many of the populations with whom I've worked, the idea of having access to history it matters deeply. And so I think we have to sort of not forget that. I think that the intersection between this conversation, Philip, and the one that you'll be having on reparations is deeply connected. And, there's a point at which legal remedy sort of falls away because of rules of evidence and rules of legal procedure, which, separate conversation, which also deeply impacted the Mull case in different ways, but then turns over into sort of restorative justice. And in fact, I just finished up editing a book across various landscapes on this. And, I think it's this is really an issue, and I saw one pop up in the feed in the quote unquote sort of, culture wars today. And I think these are more salient than ever, more important than ever. And I think the work that so many people, and it's such a collective team effort of historians are doing to provide the knowledge that's needed in order for people to sort of have a sense of how they want to move forward. I think that there's huge importance to that in my own mind.
Yeah, I mean, I'll come back to that cultural question in a minute. I'm sort of jumping around a bit, but really kind of step further. There's a question from Robert Newman, and again to Caroline. From her current work, does she see potential witnesses of colonial violence from Palestine, Malaya, Aden, Nyasaland coming forward to build potential cases similar to the Mull and Cypriot case? I mean, it did seem that when the trial was, the various stages of the trial were going on, there were cases waiting in the wings, but not all of those materialized in the end. And I wonder what you're feeling, Caroline. Are there going to be further cases of this sort, or could that have been maybe the last one?
Sure. No, it's a really great question, Philip. I think there are a couple of things to bear in mind with that, and maybe a reason why we didn't see these kind of cascading cases coming out. The first of which is, I think I mentioned in some of my earlier remarks, is that 1954 period, right? And so, one. Two, that in the context of the case that the judge ruled, which now is precedent, that the actual claimants themselves, those who experienced abuse, can only file. The last one has to do with also the question of statute of limitations. And so part of the case, which I kind of flattened a little bit in my remarks, was that the claimants had to demonstrate that they could not have filed their case any sooner than they did in 2009. So that then kind of gets back to kind of old sort of historical arguments of sort of how new was this research when it came out in 2005? And the judge had to rule on that. He literally had to sort of decide, when does his clock start? Because if the clock started with the 2005 publications of Imperial Reckoning and History of the Hanged, then that meant that that was the point at which the claimants had the actual ability, the evidence to even file a claim. Does that make sense? And so therefore, that was also part of this. And so in all these witness statements, Dave and I had to in particular sort of go through the historiography of basically our field. The Kenyan field was kind of litigated around this, right? We had to go through the historiography and show, yes, there was a little bit in Anthony Clayton's counterinsurgency in Kenya. There's a little bit here, but there's a big difference between having a sense of something, a few paragraphs here and there, even a chapter of something, and a full, thoroughgoing kind of legal roadmap of evidence that a court can examine. And so that's precisely what the court was ruling. Now, the reason I raised this is because in the Cypriot case, it was a little fuzzy in my mind because the ECHR case had already happened in the 50s. The claimants had knowledge of their ability to take something to court because of the work, ironically, that the Cypriot Human Rights Group was doing, right? As opposed to, I actually think the most salient case in all of this is potentially the Aden case. But right now, given political circumstances, the chances of that happening are probably quite low. It happened later, there might be people alive, but given circumstances external to the filing of a case of such abuses, I have heard nothing about sort of the, anything in the wind with that. And the others, again, are all too early, pre-54. I mean, if we went to Palestine, particularly in the Arab Revolt, extraordinary. I mean, we've got lots and lots of evidence, but anyway.
Jim, is there anything, have you come across other cases, sort of Africa-related cases, that were on the point of being brought from other territories you're aware of?
No.
I mean, I remember there was there was some talk about a Malawian case being brought, but again, that seemed to kind of peter out.
Yeah, I can't think of any. I mean, there certainly is talk, and the general principle that Mandy discussed regarding repatriation of what are properly national archives in East Africa. That has been, I have heard that discussed by Tanzania-based academics and academics in Zanzibar as well, but nothing beyond that general principle to my knowledge anymore. So.
Okay, there's we're kind of getting close to 6 o'clock. There's a kind of a question by Thomas Wright, which I'll sort of slightly paraphrase because it is slightly the elephant in the room at the moment with the Black Lives Matter protests, this extraordinary global movement that we've seen. And there was the article by George Monbiot in The Guardian I referred to a bit earlier, which again was sort of coming off the back of Rhodes Must Fall. Boris says, we mustn't destroy statues because that's destroying history, but the British have been hiding their history, hiding their files. There's an intense interest in the British colonial history and British colonial violence now, which for those of us working in the field, of course, is welcome. But it also becomes all the more sensitive and difficult when you step into the public domain and try and make a case in this sort of very, very polarized background. I wonder what the panelists think about this and what their own experiences have been over the last few days of this. I mean, Mandy, starting with Mandy, maybe.
Yes, it's very interesting, isn't it? Because I mean, I certainly have the feeling that with all of this varied interest at the moment, for a lot of us, this is an opportunity to seize the time.
Yeah.
But how do you do that?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in response to the George Monbiot piece, I wrote a letter to the Guardian, which of course they haven't published. But I mean, all I can do is sort of nibble away around the edges. I just don't have the experience to know how to dive in and really make an impact.
It is a problem that's come up during this seminar, isn't it? That we hold meetings like this, we get very enthused, and then the kind of momentum dissipates because there aren't ongoing campaigns around this. And I suppose we need to think about this, how we really try and coordinate our efforts over things like archives. Jim, would you like to come in?
I'll just say two things briefly. One, and it was touched on a little bit earlier, and that has to do with the really tricky question of the transition of power, right? What happens with these materials, which in some obviously with Kenya are so explosive and essentially, to put it crudely, identify informants, collaborators, if you want to use that language. How does that transfer of power work? I guess so. It's a related question, but we're talking about the sort of legacy of colonialism. It's in the case of Tanzania. I mean, Tom McGuire, if he's still on, he'll know about this. A fair number of the informants were initially laid off and then brought back to work after a while. And there is a wonderful article by Richard Rathbone, almost 30 years ago now, I think. It was sort of a first shot at the colonial, at the sort of special branch archives and the transfer of power in Accra, in Gold Coast, Ghana, that gets at those thorny questions of the utility to the new regime, right? It's not a clear-cut division between colonialism ending and a new regime that will create an intelligence network out of whole cloth. But what is interesting is to what extent, and this is something the Hanslope archives just give us glimpses of, to what extent is the reading in process? How does that work? What is being included? This is all about exclusion, right? This is all about the archives, the euphemism of that. What is being included? Who are the people whose various compromised positions are of value to the incoming government, and they wish to retain that information for their own purposes? So I guess my interests really are on that transition. It's a really, really tricky subject to get at, but to what extent do the sort of, basically blackmailable elements of the entire special branch process, to what extent does that become a part of the new regime, and to what extent is it created out of whole cloth, which of course we know it was with post-colonial intelligence operations. So I don't know if that directly gets at the Black Lives Matter.
I think you wrote.
But I'm really interested in how that historical dynamic, can be communicated when we have this surge of interest in the general question of colonial violence. So.
I think you raise a really interesting point, because we, as historians, we've been talking about releasing material, the importance of releasing material, and yet MI6 still says it won't open its files because it might compromise sources. And I, with your work on Dennis Pombe, you were able to kind of, in a way, join the dots from what was available and identify an informant. I've seen stuff in the Colonial Office Intelligence and Security Department files on Malawi. And I thought, well, if you had a little bit of local knowledge, and you, even though the person isn't named, you could identify who that person was. So in a sense, there is a tightrope to be walked here in terms of declassification, isn't there? And it's not a sort of straightforward or easy issue. Right.
Absolutely. I should say I'm a little I've published this article, very proud of it, but there's a queasiness I will always have for the rest of my life about this article, and it goes to a general principle about demanding massive transparency. There's a serious cost to it. So.
Yeah. Thank you, Russell. Can I bring you
in? Yeah, sure. I mean, I suppose my problem is similar to Mandy's, is knowing how now to kind of keep momentum and how to make that difference. I mean, I'm at the very earliest stages of my academic career, I only finished my PhD about 2 months ago. And so I'm in that very early stage of just figuring out now how to take this work I've been working on and actually ride the momentum of this, or even if indeed it's worth doing. I mean, the work that I've done is on a very specific group of people, and there's a larger conversation around the involvement of medical practitioners involved in actual forms of violence more generally, which is outside of British colonial history. As I say, the inspiration for the work really came from my own views on the war on terror in the early 2000s. So there's this bigger conversation there as well, in the relationship between expertise and the perpetration of violence. And yeah, so I'm unsure. I would ask these questions myself and be very keen to hear other people's wisdom on this one and direction.
Thank you, Caroline. Last word goes to you.
Well, thank you for that, Philip. I suppose two things. I mean, the first one is to kind of take this question about the culture wars and really kind of put it into the big picture, right? And we've talked about this, or at least I've touched upon it, but you know, if we think about liberalism and imperialism being mutually constitutive, right? And on the one hand, on one side of the coin, we have, you know, all the things that we associate with liberalism: rule of law, free trade, et cetera, being mutually constitutive in the 19th century around the same time as 19th century empire, with its underbelly to it, right? With all those things that we think about: racism, classism, sexism, the propensity of violence to execute these things, which is thrown into relief in the mid-19th century with Fitzjames Stephen and 1857 revolt and Morant Bay, et cetera, et cetera. And we see this constantly playing itself out from this period of time, really all the way to the present day. But let's stick with empire for a minute, right? All the way through the end of empire, where the ability of liberal imperialism, as I keep saying, unlike fascism has a sort of, it has its own end game, and that is it's going to stay forever, these empires, whereas liberal imperialism is ostensibly reformist. And every time something happens, there's an ostensible gesture to a kind of reform, whether through shifts in lexicon or whatever the case may be, whilst at the same time this propulsion at its heart to have these violent mechanisms, which are understood to be part and parcel of it. And this is what makes Justice McComb so upset in the context of the Mau case. But if we keep thinking about sort of these abilities to sort of repress and emancipate at the same time, that's playing out literally on the streets of London and all over the US today, everywhere. Right. And so the enduring capability of these power structures, however reinvented, right, around, and the ability of sort of race and gender and hierarchy to be excluded within these larger ones. And it's not, this is sort of not meant as kind of in any way of a value statement amongst colleagues or anybody else, but just as an observation of what we see playing out and how it relates to what we're up to. And when we think about this, Hanslope disclosure and these archives are just one manifestation of all of this. That's it. That's how, at the end of the day, we can read it just as that. And so as we sort of excavate that what I was saying in the beginning, in some of my initial remarks, that always has to be front-brained. In other words, how is it that we read this into the larger sort of ideological framework in which this has been both produced and released? Similarly, how do we read Roads Must Fall, several years ago when it was unsuccessful, to what's happening now, sort of what's changed in the world, right? Well, some of it is getting back again to when we've seen ruptures in liberal imperialism, they're often accompanied, frankly, only accompanied by violence. That's the only time we see it. And so right now, and when, the longer conversation for another seminar, Philip, that you run on fentanyl and everybody else, but I think it's important for us to think about that. And then when I think about it, I don't want to sort of project myself onto others. When I think about, roles as academics and historians and people know like so much like Mandy does about archives, I think there's a certain amount by which from our relative positions of privilege, we can sort of stake out what our sort of, we can either sit in our cockpit of as we do our books, or, sort of be more outspoken about certain things. And I think I think in my own way, as have others, for better or for worse, did some of that early on in the career, which was rather terrifying. I think if I were in that position now as somebody older, I would have been even more terrified. I didn't know any better when I was younger. But that's, you know, we all sort of grow up at various points.
Yeah.
But I do think that sort of challenging some of this within our own institutions, when we look at how knowledge is produced, when, you know, I keep coming back, the importance of returning archives to where they belong, right? You know, these are various things. And then also supporting those who are really, really on the front lines of trying to make some of these things happen. And sometimes as historians, we're as much observers in our activism through that kind of support as we are sort of, you know, sort of demonstratively making claims. But so anyway, my parting words are both on sort of a much more intellectual, sort of up there basis on liberal imperialism, and also on a, you know, it's the, you know, I think the time is now, and for many of us, where our beliefs and our work reflect what's playing out on the street. I think that just asking oneself, how can one be doing something even more than what we're doing now? And that includes, and I'll thank you, Phil, the kinds of work that you're doing with the Institute. This is extremely important, and I thank you very much for gathering us all here today.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you for your contribution. Thank you, Mandy. Thank you, Russell. Thank you, Jim. It's been a wonderful discussion. I know from the chat, from the comments we've had, I think people have really enjoyed it. And it sparked so many interesting ideas, and we will follow this up. But for now, thank you all so much. Thank you for joining us. Have a very good weekend, and stay in touch. Thanks a lot, everyone.